So in finding my way, really me getting on this land was a way to achieve shalom bayit and in my house, because I was a kosher butcher and I was trapped in the city in this meat plant, and grains just sort of spoke to me as being accessible, not too needy. You don't have to make sure, every day you don't have to watch over them and baby them all day long like you do vegetables or fruits. And I quickly realized that I could not compete scale-wise, and that the actual cost of the grain that I was producing was extraordinary. I mean, we're talking $25 a pound or something like that. And I quickly sort of had to figure out a way to add value, retain value, and create something that could be a little bit more accessible and more durable and sustainable in the long term. And that's when I started to mill my own grains. In milling grains, you add significant value because you're taking it from a hard, for most people, less palatable than a loaf of bread product as a whole kernel. And you're making it into something that innately most of us have cravings for. In also creating values, we tried to add kosher and specifically yashon grains. It was from there that we just grew. And so now we are actually milling grains from somewhere south of about 500 acres per year. And then to meet that goal, I have contracts with farmers that I work with who have developed strong layers of trust, and I grow their seed for them. And so that's primarily what I'm doing on my farm right now, is I'm trying to identify wheats that grow well here, and I'm growing seed for grains that people can grow at much larger scale that I can then mill into flour that people can eat.
Wow. How long was that span of time that you just described?
Explained. We first started in on this land in the middle of 2014. Grains really came to the forefront in end of 2015. I planted my first winter wheat crop. In 2016, we harvested, and we had a significant, by our standards at that point, it was significant. It was a quarter acre or something like that. And then we had other grain trials and things going on. And by 2016, we were planting out on multiple acre plots, and I found this dinky little Japanese rice combine on eBay and really started going for it. So that's yeah.
You mentioned yashan grains.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone would be familiar with that. What's that?
We learn out. There's a mitzvah given to us that we're not allowed to eat so-called new grains or chadash, and these are understood to be grains that have not taken root before Pesach, and this is all tied into the Pesach and ultimately the shavuot offering. But specifically, you cannot make an offering on grain that has not completed its cycle or started its cycle, before Passover. And if the grain is planted after Passover, you have to wait until, I believe it's you cannot give it as a korban, as an offering, until the following year. That is the context of it. So chadash refers to this new grain that is prohibited to you, and yashan is old, literally old, and that is the permitted grain. I identified that specifically through through my relationship with rabbis in the OU and the Star K, it was becoming something that they wanted to promote more as an issue of kashrut, and it was something that very much spoke to me because it tied into Matan Torah, into shavuos, and so I took it on, and that's what I do. All my grains are yashan.
Which is what this time period that we're in right now, it's all about that, right?
All about, you got it. Practically speaking, how we observe that these days is that there are a few different shitas or understandings. One of them says it has to be 10 days before Passover starts. One of them says it has to be 3 days before Passover starts. And then b'diavad, if you didn't, extenuating circumstances, you could literally plant them Erev Pesach, and there would be ways to call that yashan. We try not to get into those positions, although I have planted Erev Pesach several times. We try not to get into that position by working mostly with fall planted grains, which just sort of make it easy for you.
So already we're only a couple minutes into this talk, and I can see how much Torah is woven into what you're doing. Like it's both your motivation and goal, and you're growing and moving, but it's you probably feel that aspect of Torah while you're milling and while you're involved in this whole thing. The other, I just wanted to point that out, how wonderful that is. The other thing that I noticed is how much there that and other people have definitely seen this, how part of what you're growing is not just grains, but that you're actually growing community. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like how you see the growing of the type of grains that you're growing, the methods that you're using, and just the way in which you're approaching this work, that it's both like something that's growing community and as an education, some sort of beautiful hybrid of educational community and actual business. And why, maybe you could also talk about why you turned towards that. What was interesting about that for you?
You mean the community aspect specifically?
Yeah, well, I mean, to anyone that sees what you're doing, it's obvious that being part of either picking up the flower from Migrash, or just reading what you're doing, and especially even when you just start talking about it now, that community and learning is woven into what you're doing. And
Right.
why particularly, I'm sure we could get into that, which is what is the Torah of wheat and where we go with that. But even before we do, like what called you towards weaving all these, the community education and literally just the physical growing and buying and selling of it?
Well, so for context, I've been involved in local sustainable agriculture now for almost 20 years, and mostly in vegetables, and before that, stone fruits. And it was, as a value, keeping it local and having a more direct line to the consumer was something that was absolutely vital for me, because I feel such a strong connection to it on a deeper personal and spiritual level. Maybe it's just sort of it's just a function of my own enthusiasm for it, that I bring it to other people. I think, though, that as I've learned, this is something that people have really been asking for a connection to for a long time. There are vegetables and fruit are relatively accessible to many people in a direct local realm. Dairy, meat, and grains are much less accessible. And given the great environmental impacts and societal impacts of grain in particular, which, to be honest, there is no meat industry and there is no dairy industry if there's no grain industry. Bringing that directly to people and showing them the difference, selfishly, it makes me all warm and fuzzy inside when somebody comes and says, I never tried your flour before. I bought a bag last week. I made a loaf of bread and I didn't know what bread was like before that. And that's not me. It's not that I'm, doing some super special proprietary practice. I'm just doing it the way that it was done for thousands of years until literally 120 years ago. Wheat was, every town had a miller. Many towns were built around riverways because you needed the river to run the mill so that you could have your grain and make your bread. And I think that it just sort of bringing that back together was both organic, but also somewhat purposeful. The educational component of it, I am a recovering junior high school science teacher, and I had the opportunity in my last teaching stint to bring my students out to the farm monthly and essentially do an in-depth Torah grain learning with it. And when I saw kids some of whom had never stepped off pavement before, save maybe grass in their yard, come out to the farm, seed oat cover crop in the fall with me, and in the spring, go through all of the things, and just the wow on their face. But I don't think it's a wow, this is really cool. I think it's, wow, I'm tapping into something that is really deep inside of me, because grain and humans, like there's none of this stuff that we're talking about without this direct relationship between us and grains, and to see people tap into that is pretty amazing. It should be noted, 100 years ago, the majority of people who are on this Zoom call right now, their ancestors were working with grains. They were in some capacity, and it's something that I think we all could get a little bit closer to again. So.
And going off of that, we have a question in the chat from Hyla and Dove. They say, speaking of Torah, this afternoon speaker, Eli Ragosa, described planting ancient grains along with clover and other seeds, speaking of intercropping. Could you speak to this practice of intercropping in light of the laws of Kilayim?
Sure. So in Mishnah's Kilayim, it starts off talking about what the permitted and the forbidden mixtures are. So right off the bat, we learn that mixing and seeding crops together is not inherently wrong. There are just very, very specific ways that we are prescribed to do it. Now, it should also be pointed out that from a D'Rabbanan, from a rabbinical position, Kilayim only applies in Eretz Yisrael. It does not apply in Chutz La'aretz. And so that it just spins it a little bit, but I'll try to maybe work my way back to that point in a second. In agronomy, which is the formal term for growing grains and pulses, legumes, dry land growing of these crops, over thousands of years, there have been very strong relationships created between legumes and cereals. In the wintertime, you can plant wheat, rye, barley, spelt with an undersowing of clover, vetch, alfalfa, peas if you're really adventurous, although they'll probably smother out your crop. And in doing so, you're reducing your need to work that land. You are providing cover that's going to shade out weeds. You are adding nitrogen to your system. As the grains grow and they start to become more competitive over the legumes, and the legumes start to die back, even though they don't die off completely, they die back. All of the nitrogen that they embody is released to these grains, and it's very much a symbiosis. And it's not just an old world thing. In the new world, we have the three sisters, where corn was specifically planted with beans. And then once those two were up off the ground, you planted your squash to shade out everything else. So if you go back to the Mishnah and you start to look at what you can mix and what you can't mix, it's very clear that this chok, if you will, this how do you define chok? I don't know. This proclamation that you're not allowed to mix things is very much rooted in sort of a deeper sort of derech hateva, like this is the way nature works, and what is our relationship to it. I will also offer that in asking the shaila to a rabbi, you are actually allowed, the actual prohibition is seeding them as a mixture at one time. So you can seed a crop of wheat, let that germinate, and then sometime later undersow it with any one of those crops, even the prohibited ones, and it is not technically an issue, at least according to the rebbeim that I spoke to. So I hope that answers that a little bit. You should know that I wholeheartedly practice kilayim here, and all of my grains get undersowed with clover. And that once I harvest off the grains, the clover, which is very small generally, then just explodes. And by the middle of the fall, you have this gorgeous blooming clover crop that you then mow down and you work in, and you're ready to plant another crop. And you have just reduced your need to add nitrogen, to add compost or organic matter. And in an organic or a traditional cereal system, it's vital. It's vital. It should also be noted that in the the grain drill, which is the primary tool used to plant grains, which was invented in England sometime in the 1700s, you have wheels that drive these little cogs in a hopper that pick up seeds and then just deposit them in the ground. They're all traditionally built with a seed box and what's called the grass box. The grass box is the box that you put your clover in. And it's one pass. You plant your clover and your grain at one time. It's also very telling that the clover boxes are the ones that rot out first on all of these old implements, and the seed boxes are what are durable. So that's a side note though.
One of the things that came up for me when you were talking was the in rabbinic literature, but also the midrashic literature, the understanding of the earth and the way a seed works with the earth. Like when I was young, and in school, the way I see it is the seed goes into the earth, and then it extracts resources out of the ground to feed itself, in which it then grows into a plant. That's the description. However, in lots of ancient sort of way of framing that, especially the Jewish ones, describes the seed goes into the earth and it gets completely destroyed. Then it kind of irritates and instigates the earth to become the plant. And so the plant is not the seed growing up. It's actually the seed pushes and instigates and irritates, like an oyster, sort of, the earth to make a plant out of itself. So the plant or the tree or the grass is literally just the earth becoming plant. And the seed is sort of like the irritating information that says, hey, do this. It's a similar way of the way animal reproduction is looked at in the Torah as well, to the point where like the earth, like the rich fertile soil is like the womb, and the seed is what's making the womb give birth to child. And one of the interesting things about the halachic differentiation, like why is halacha making these differences, and why is the Torah making these differences? Like it doesn't want two seeds going into the same place, because then it's like kilayim, it's like competing, like it's working a horse and an elephant together, or whatever, or a horse and a donkey and an ox together. In other words, it's like putting them into the same hole. But if it's just spaced out a little, then that's okay. Or if it's not at the same time, then that's okay. But it's the sort of the insemination of the seed that's the issue, because the earth is sort of becoming. And actually, is one of the things that Eli Ragosa was talking about, seeing it as motherly. And definitely that's in the Torah. Like it's just the way the Torah looks at that soil. The one thing that also was coming out for me when you were talking about like three sisters and the intercropping is like, and the clover is like this way of giving relief to one of the aspects of the work that's happening at the time, the activity. Right, so you have like activity on one end, it would just be too much, so you allow another thing to have its space. And I think there's many parts of the Pirkei Avot and Jewish sort of the sages of the Torah, the sagely advice, which is like one of them is like Ein Kemach Ein Torah, right? Which is like, if you don't, which is almost sort of like an intercropping, right? Like if you're going to spend your entire day focusing on nothing but learning, and you don't do any work, then you exhaust the learning. And I know that I experienced that in my own life, like nonstop mental, trying to figure things out mentally without the physical expression ends up to be not just like draining, but actually you're not really understanding it. Like you're actually not understanding it without the physical application. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I know it's certainly the Torah of wheat has a lot to do with that interplay. I'm wondering what your thoughts.
Well, I think before we can get there, we sort of have to understand the place that ultimately bread, but flour, and then before that, plants and grains in particular have in this storyline, and it's in Bereshit, it's in Genesis, where we learn that seeds after their kind, plants that produce seeds after their kind, have been given to us, and we are to steward them. But we also learn that the Garden of Eden and the growth of all of this does not even happen until after Shabbos, and does not happen until there is a person there who can do the work. It actually refers to man being a necessary, humans being a necessary part of bringing forth this herbage. And so that's all well and good, and we've got this nice little hippy dippy lifestyle going on in the Gan, and we mess up, and we eat from the tree that we're not supposed to, and one of the punishments, as it were, and I would argue it's not so much a punishment, but it's basically God saying this is how you have to live your life, is that we have to toil. We have to work for our food, and we have to bust through the soil, and we have to deal with the thistles, and it's going to be hard. And
that's making me very uncomfortable.
and it's not going to be easy to feed yourself. And to bring that back to in Kemach and Torah and Kemach, Kemach as it literally is flour, but it's oftentimes understood by the Mefarshim, the sages who have explained this out, to be to represent just working towards something in general. And there's no Torah without effort, essentially.
I mean, that itself is very telling. Like even that conflation of working for wheat as exhausting yourself working as like the ultimate expression of that is itself a whole story, right?
Yeah, but yes. That's one I probably don't have the wherewithal to rightly explain my experience with. Yeah, so it takes work to achieve these higher planes of relationship with ourselves, with each other, with God, and where we all fit into it, which is the Torah. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's a two-way street. They are feeding off of each other, if you will. I mean, the entire lashon is not, ein kemach ein Torah. It's not without wheat there is no Torah, nor is it ein Torah ein kemach. It's both of those phrases to put together, as we have to understand it. And for me, where it sort of really comes home is a re-listening to the bracha of Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Traditionally hamotzi is understood to mean who brings forth bread from the earth, but I like to think about it in terms of am I yotzi this effort that it took to make this loaf or not? And I would argue I and most everybody else is not fully yotze, or has been taken out of their obligation to make this loaf. And that's part of it, is that we recognize that this relationship with God to make this loaf of bread, and God is hamotzi. God is the one who gave us the opportunity to fulfill this necessary work to make this bread, and to sort of get to the place of whatever a suda really is. Bread is part of a suda, and a suda is not just a meal. It's something that's a much higher level of engagement with God, and so that then just sort of takes it up to shavuos and the lechem that's offered on shavuos as our way of actually being able to receive the Torah. It's a very tight and well constructed storyline we have here regarding bread and Torah. And I'll remind you that the korban that we bring for shavuos is not just a korban of some funky heirloom whole wheat grain. No, it's your finest flour that you can possibly bring. That is what you have to make this loaf out of. And it is through that effort to make the finest flour possible to build that loaf that you then can put yourself into the position of being able to receive Torah. And so every time I say Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, I'm thinking in Kemach in Torah, maybe not literally or consciously, but that's like my view of it as I get there. And I just want to, I see there's a couple questions. There's one question here. I don't want to lose this question about kilayim. Yes, there are prohibited plants that mustn't be planted with grain, but they are specifically listed as plants that you cannot plant, or seeds you cannot plant at the same time with a grain seed. And as noted before, with that separation of time, it then does become permitted to you. And to Clara, Southern States seed exposure. That's where Southern States Co-op, and for my clover seed. They're good. They've got lots of organic seed.
um, Ian Yosef.
Mhm.
One of the scenes in receiving the Torah, which is very beautiful, is one after receiving the Torah. After there's a whole scene and a fight and a mess up and a fall and all that stuff. But at the sort of end of the experience, there's hold on a second. There's this really wonderful moment where the in the Torah it says that the people gathered and they ate right in front of God and no one got hurt. Do you remember?
Um, I think so.
So I'm wondering because you said that a suda, which is a meal, is not just a suda. It's like the ultimate expression, sort of. I'm not sure. I don't know the exact words that you said, but it's like a suda is not just a meal. It's this elevated level, and that's something I think that is interesting, not completely unique, but pretty unique to the Torah. This idea of how important eating is. It's also very central to Shavuot because first fruit, you're bringing the bread and you bring the first fruits there, to eat with the Creator. That your eating is in process with the Creator. It's like you're eating the meal that you did together, which is sort of what you were saying. I want to just be able to restate what you said about Hamotzi. That's the blessing that we make. I just want to make sure that everyone, for if we didn't know, that's the blessing that we make on bread. And hamotzi lechem min haaretz, you're thanking the Creator for the one that brings the bread from the earth, while really, which is always understood really quickly, is that it took a lot of work to do it. So it wasn't necessarily just the Creator. So the irony of the verse is part of that. And if you maybe you could reflect on that a little. How do you see that relationship, or restate it? How do you see the relationship with Ein Kemach, Ein Torah, meaning without work, i.e., without flour, there's no Torah? How do you see that in relationship to Hamotzi, in particular? Because you said like while you're holding it, you're thinking of both those things.
Well, I mean, I have either the luxury or the curse of being intimately involved in making flour, and I also happen to, at this point in time anyways, be the primary bread baker in my house. And whether it's schlepping up to Pennsylvania and loading 2,000-pound bins of grain, multiple 2,000-pound bins of grain into a truck and going on these big adventures to procure grain, or setting up this crazy antiquated equipment that needs to be repaired and is slightly dangerous and could, lop your arm off or something like that. Like we take it for granted, the actual gauntlet that it is to get to a flour that you can eat. And it's not just, I think maybe where it starts to transcend that, and why Hamotzi is both sort of acknowledging the God that brings it forth, but also Hamotzi, the one who motzis me in the effort to help bring that forth, is because you can have all of the right timing, you can grow the most luscious, beautiful field, and then in the last month you get the wrong rains at the wrong times and you lose your entire crop and there's no food available to you. And it's unfortunately, it is something that still happens all over the world. Fortunately, there are many different ways that people have dealt with this. But sort of seeing it on the intimate side, I think it allows me the opportunity to really acknowledge that, one, I put a hell of a lot of effort into, excuse my language, sorry. I put a lot of I put a lot of effort into it, and
Not on radio. You can just curse away.
yeah, I put a lot of effort into it, and really, it wasn't up to me that this grain actually made it all the way through. I can pat myself on the back the whole time that I want, but it really is not me. It took my effort. It was a partnership for sure, but ultimately it was Hashem who decided when the rain should fall and what kind of rain should fall and how that's going to affect my crop. Practically speaking, last year we lost with one of my growers. We harvested a 20-some acre field of wheat, only to find out that because of the rains coming when they did, it was, one, too high a load of fungal toxins that it would be toxic to us to eat, and two, it was all sprouted on the stalks, so it wouldn't even make bread in the first place. You could dry it out and grind it and do something with it, but even then, and between me and the farmer, that's a very, very significant loss. That was, again, tens of thousands of pounds of grain that went to cows in Pennsylvania.
Well, that's literally the counting of the Omer, which is what we're in right now. I mean, one of the parts of the counting of the Omer is to so delicately count every single day from the beginning of the ancient grain harvest till shavuot, the end of the ancient grain harvest, or the culmination of it, is so that you're counting the days so that it doesn't rain on your grain, right?
Right.
In the field. So it's like you're literally, that's your Omer. It's like you don't want it to rain on your parade. And when it does, your parade's over, right? So
Yeah.
wheat is particularly acute and sort of severe example or metaphor for that aspect of life.
Right. Yeah.
We have a question from David. David, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So I liked what you said about Hamotzi Lechem, and I wanted to give another direction and to ask you what you think about. So while learning the language Arabic, I found that the word lahme actually means meat.
Mm-hmm.
And then I looked at the word lechem, and first of all, it also has the roots of lechima, which is fight.
Mm-hmm.
Also has the roots of like welding or like melting two things together, making them into one.
Mm-hmm.
And I also know that also in our culture and in Judaism, lechem also refers to food in general.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to challenge ourselves back to the story of creation, that the punishment is to work for lechem. Maybe like growing grains doesn't serve us anymore. Or maybe there is something beyond the grain that like we can find a way how to shift the motzi lechem into something that is even healthier, more sustainable. I'm just, because like we said that like it took human being to the edge in industrialization, the grain. Like the researcher said that the grain domesticated us and not we domesticated them. We can also look at it. So can you relate to the word lechem also in a wider, or look at this beyond actually grain and like pointing to some
well, I think you're hitting on it, which is that while lechem and bread and kemach and flour and chita and all of the wheat, these are all very specific things that are tangible that we can grasp. They are also more metaphorical, and when you sort of step out into that more metaphorical realm and you start to link up all of these different ideas, the phonetics of meat in Arabic. Milchama, a war, for instance, it's the same shoresh. You are rightly pointing out that there is a very strong relationship between the development of culture and societies and these grains. And while I also share, I think, where you're going with this is that we need to find a way to potentially diversify and get away from this thing that is so potentially impactful. I will also offer that there is not any food source that I know of on this planet that can provide as much nutrition to an individual as a cereal can. You have a whole grain cereal has all of the amino acids except for lysine, which you can get from beans and legumes. It has all of the major macronutrients and minerals. And, you know, pushing away this idea, I would say that the ideal is that, yes, we all have our gardens. We're getting away from manual agriculture. We're eating more from fruit trees. We're eating more from a permanence and a realm of sustainability. And the flip side of that is that the overwhelming majority of humanity is not in a position to do that. And it presents a conundrum of how do you balance those things? And I think that I don't think that there's an easy way out for being a human and not having some amount of dependency on annual grains. From an ecological perspective, from an anthropological perspective, I don't know if it's possible on the scale that we would all like it to be possible. And I very much acknowledge that grain agriculture is the epitome of high technology and the excess and potential frivolousness of our technology. I mean, you have to put you think of the book of Ruth, and all of the imagery is of these large groups of people who are working in the fields together. You have your harvesters, you have your people who are sheaving it, you have your people who are taking it to the threshing floor, you have your aniyim, your poor people who are gathering afterwards. It was a very communal thing. Well, and that was happening at a time where we learned that most everybody had animals that they kept. The animals all pooped in the Reshut Rabim, in the public area, and everybody would get together and shovel up that trampled poop from the Reshut Rabim, and they would have to all physically go out, take it to their fields and use it. Now we've got the Haber process that gives us nitrogen with enough petroleum to make that energy happen. We've got $500,000 John Deere combines that can cut a 28-foot swath at a time, and can completely clear a 5-acre field in maybe 30 minutes. There are two extremes of what grains can be, and also acknowledging that even in antiquity, the misuse and mistreatment of land to grow grains was something that sunk many a civilization. The loss of topsoil, the making the land saline because you irrigated to get it to germinate, but then it was really dry, and so it all just evaporated and you're left with salt. Like it's a really, really, really big deal. And at the same time, you know, 8 billion people in the world, or whatever we're pushing now. It's crazy. How do we feed them? So That's it. I don't have an easy answer for you, David, but
That was
but I do believe that if grains are done right, they are parallel in importance to a more sustainable perennial-based agriculture. There has to be a place for them. So.
Thank you, Ian Yosef, for that answer. Yeah, there. I can tell you're looking in the chat. So we have another question from Elon Dove. Could you tell us why you decided to grow ancient grains and not just conventional bread flour? And also from Rita, the gematria of motzi is 147 and of kemach is 148. So are we humans the addition to turn grain to kemach and kemach to bread?
That's a good one, Rita. Thank you. Let's go first. The ancient grains. When I started getting into growing grains, spelt was on the rise. People were perceiving negative effects of modern wheat in their lives. I think the time was right, but also by training, I'm a botanist, and so I'm a plant dork. And growing wheat is pretty cool, and there are a lot of beautiful wheats out there, but growing emmer is even cooler because emmer is gorgeous, and spelt is gorgeous, and they all have these amazing, as they're ripening and they're going from a green upright stalk and starting to fall over, they all take on characteristic shapes and colors and the length of the appendages and everything. I mean, so for me, it was really just tapping into diversity as well as kind of reading the marketplace and seeing what people wanted. The last part of it too is that in this region in particular, in the Mid-Atlantic, we're very prone to the crop failure due to diseases, and most of the ancient grains, by way of their embedded resistance via their genetic profiles, but also the fact that they retain a klipa, they retain a covering, a hole on the actual kernel that protects them. And that reduces all sorts of things. It moderates between the grain and the ambient conditions of moisture and temperature. It prevents insects from getting in there. The fungal pathogens have a harder time getting at the grain. So there's also a very practical aspect to it, growing those grains in this region. Rita, I don't know. You tell me. Are we humans the addition to turn the grain to kemach? I don't know. Does kemach occur on its own?
Listening to. No, I was listening. When you were speaking, I just started switching the letters to numbers and enjoyed that there was one difference, and started thinking, I mean, that we're partners with the Rabbanu Shalom.
Right.
I mean, Kamach, the Rabbanu Shalom is the Hamotzi, but then we join in the process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like and Dove wrote.
She brings forth bread from the earth using humans as tools or in partnership with humanity. Yeah, I think that's sort of a restating of it. Yeah, I think the meta thing that we're trying to bring out here is that grains and these holidays that are intimately about these grains it's really highlighting our relationship with God. More than the loaf of bread, more than that beautiful field of wheat, it's highlighting our relationship with God, and that loaf of bread doesn't happen without your relationship to God.
Before we answer more questions in the chat, I just want to note that it's 2 minutes to 9. So if anybody feels the need to log off, that's totally okay. but I think we're going to go a little bit over time just to keep the discussion flowing. So we will formally conclude this lovely discussion technically. A couple things I want to note if people are on their way out. There are several more exciting speakers in our Shavuot Sojourn, and we would love to see you there this week. Our next lecture tomorrow at 12 p.m. will be with Khadija Spence about Jewish values and environmental education. You can register for these sessions at any time on our website, pearlstonecenter.org/Shavuot2020. And thank you very much. So yeah, let's continue this discussion.
Sure. David, should we go to your question here? The pandemic has been...
It's actually Sarah's question.
Oh, it is Sarah's question. Is that... Hi, Sarah Robin. The pandemic has been crazy for my business. Before the pandemic, we did a small amount of retail sales to home bakers. And it was steady and slightly growing, but the overwhelming majority of the work the flour that we were producing was for restaurants and bakeries. I think the pandemic, one of the things that it did was it unmasked some of our consumptive habits and the industrial supply chains that were created to facilitate those consumptive habits. And all of a sudden, the restaurants are not open. Everybody is now cooking for themselves again. And meanwhile, the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the dining magazines are pumping up bread, sourdough. And all of a sudden, the shelves are empty across the nation. It's not that there's no grain. It's not that there's no flour. It's just that there's no flour packed for people to use their own. It's all packed in giant 50-pound bags or in giant tote bags that are used industrially. And the restaurants close and my wholesale business falls out from itself. And I think it was March 14th was a Sunday, I believe. And that's when all of the news cycles started getting crazy in America regarding COVID stuff, and everything started shutting down. By the middle of that week, by Monday, I had lost all my wholesale business. Pretty much every wholesale customer said, we're closing, we're not ordering from you anymore, blah, blah, blah. By Wednesday, I had already made up all of that business in retail sales times two. By the end of the week, I don't even know what magnification of the business was, but ultimately my business has gone through the roof because of the pandemic. And I think it's a little bit of circumstance, and it's a little bit of sort of greater big picture stuff. But I happen to live in a very urbanized region, Baltimore DC metro area, where there are close to 10 million mouths to feed. And so I had people who were buying flour who hadn't baked bread in 20 years, or who had never baked bread before, or who had never bought stone milled flour before, or had never even heard of spelt, or, whatever it is. It just opened up, bread and flour just opened up to the population in a way that probably has not happened in a very long time. We are starting to see that the panic buying is all done for the most part. And we are now in more of a stable place, and some of those wholesale businesses are starting to come back online as they've sort of rejiggered their business models. A lot of restaurants are now developing baking programs, and even though they can't seat people, they're selling bread from their front door. And yeah, I just, the biggest thing for me right now is that the local supply has just been obliterated. I was already most of the way through my rye and through a couple of my other wheats by the time this came through, and literally within that first week they were all done. We've now cleared out pretty much the entire mid-Atlantic of grain, myself and a few other millers, and there's none to be found that is human grade. And so I'm now going a little bit further afield. I'm bringing in grain from the Finger Lakes region. And I brought in some wheat from Kansas. And two vastly different systems. The wheat from the Finger Lakes is much like we do it here, direct from the farmer. It was the 2019 harvest. Really good vibes. The wheat from Kansas, although certified organic, very clearly had been sitting in an 80,000 bushel bin for 4 years and tossed around a bit because it was all polished. Enzymatically, it's not as functional as the new grains are. But it was a hard choice to make. You know, my business was built on local grains, and then I ran out of local grains and people still needed flour. So what do you do? And so I went back and forth a little bit, and I have since brought in tens of thousands of pounds of grain from further afield than I normally would. So, yeah. I don't think it's over yet, though. We're still dynamic. So let's see what happens.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm curious. That was awesome.
Yeah. I will just one thing to note: you cannot talk about modern grain production without considering animals. The overwhelming majority of wheat and barley that's produced goes to feed cows and chickens. Corn is now evenly split between ethanol production and feeding animals. And those industries have been hit in their own ways, and it has led to, you know, a big upheaval in the whole grain scheme, and local grain economies, as we call them, have really stepped in. And it's not just me. Every local miller I know their business has skyrocketed, and it's true in the Northeast, it's true in the Mid-Atlantic, it's true in the Pacific Northwest, it's true in the Intermountain states. It has really been a place where local food systems have come to the rescue. So, yeah.
Seems like one of those, another example of the story of wheat being right in the center of these two dichotomies of either our humanity's greatest accomplishment or worst disaster, right? And you see it also played out in the actual growing of wheat. So it's either like the most amazing thing you did that year, or the worst failure ever because of all the effort you just put into a nothing. And this split of this side or that side is also in the Torah, you know, where it's like you're on this fine line. I mean, that's even the barley is even like this split hair, this fine line between like worst disaster ever or greatest accomplishment. I'm curious. We definitely have an amazing question in there that I want to get to, but I'm also curious if on a personal level, like one of the things that you learn from doing anything in life is like the Torah of the thing. So like, what is the Torah? What is the guidance that you get from interacting with this thing physically, with this being? And I'm thinking like wheat always has, that's like the Torah of wheat. This kind of like, it's either greatest accomplishment or is there particular things that guidance that you've gotten in life, like Torah that you've extracted from the actual working with wheat, the physical properties of it?
Yeah, it's it's like a cornucopia of all emotions and all
Nice poem. Nice
all psychological states. You know, the sense of accomplishment when you work your field and then you get it planted and it's all starts sprouting and it looks so neat and clean and orderly. The sense of dread when you're looking at the weather forecasts in May and it's called multiple days straight of rain. The frustration that you have as you're harvesting or cleaning the grain, and your machine breaks down, or you get enough chaff building up under your collar that like you can no longer handle it and you have to like scream and run out and like strip down your clothes, or the amazing, you mill. This is something that most people, unfortunately, will never have the opportunity to experience. But if you ever come to Migrash Farm, I please God will allow you to experience this. When you mill flour and you're doing it right, you're keeping it somewhere around 108 degrees, 105 to 108 degrees. And when you put on gloves and you stick your hands into the warm, fluffy flour straight from the mill, like, I'm not sure if there's anything that is remotely close to that except for the mother's womb. I mean, it is such an amazing, comforting experience. And then the joy that and like gratification that you have when you eat that loaf of bread, like it's all there and it's all encompassed. And I think the Torah of it is that to keep going, just to keep going every day, you have to be able to live with all of that stuff and to roll with all of that stuff. And I think the grains teach us that very beautifully.
One of the things that I noticed, not going full Monty, is that like you, but attempting, you know, first in my life starting just eating like just bread other people made, and then be like, oh, I want to bake it myself, and then like, oh, I'm gonna grind it myself, and then one year when my daughters decided to like grow it ourselves, you know, and one of the like to be the tribe of Judah, the name Judah is gratitude. It means hodah, like to have gratitude. And one of these things that you mentioned earlier, which is hamotzi, lechem min haaretz, that bracha, where you're declaring verbally this gratitude as sort of like this quintessential Jewish thing, to be constantly declaring gratitude with blessings for things, is how you have to fetch that kavana, that intention for the blessing, to really mean it. You have to really like fetch it out, like squeeze it out, to like, so that you can actually appreciate the thing in front of you when you haven't done any of the work, right? So like when I bought bread from somebody else that I had nothing to do with, it just kind of like force myself to have gratitude and then like break through stuff, and then all of a sudden I'm grateful. But when in each little incremental level that I had my hand in it, like I sweated for it, then all of a sudden it was like almost impossible not to have gratitude. Like, it's not ego that grew by the fact that I had my hand in it. It was actually just like immense gratitude that grew from like the actual interaction with it. I'm wondering, like, what aspects of that work for you? Like, if that's like, because I have like the tiniest drop of it, what aspects of this work like brought out and bring that out in you? I have two questions actually. What is, in the same way that wheat is sort of like this double-edged thing where like the greatest fail or the greatest accomplishment in your life, what's your wheat? Like what's your wheat? Like the thing that is like is either your greatest accomplishment or your greatest weakness. And the other thing is like, what is I mean, for me, the Torah of wheat is also that, like, if you put work into it, then you get the love, right? Like it's worth and if you don't put your work into it, then it's like a whole effort to bring it out. Those are the two things that come up for me. But
well, to answer your first question, the first thing that popped into my mind was what is my wheat? My wheat is Migrash Farm. as an entity unto itself. It's there have been times where it's felt like an ultimate failure, and there have been times where it has just felt like the greatest accomplishment ever. And that is not purely in financial realms. That's also in morale. That's in family dynamics, you name it, from very personal to very sort of mundane things. It's the farm and the business itself, I think, are that wheat for me. So
where like you're sitting and you're like, is this the biggest hubris ever?
Right. Well, sometimes I actually stay up late at night sometimes, like trying to fall asleep, and I'm just like, am I just stupid? What is there something wrong? Was I not wired properly? Like, why am I doing this?
Why didn't someone stop you?
Right, exactly. And thank God I have an amazing wife who is very supportive and encouraging, and has seen the benefit to me and to us together that this brings, and even when I'm in a place of doubt, she helps to remind me that it really is a good thing, and there's a lot of good stuff coming from it.
So my other question is, aside from your wife, which is probably the biggest one, who has been a resource to you in this journey? Like either intellectual, or have you as you stretch into this work and start to do it, what are the resources that helped you get there? Maybe in people or outside of people or in organizations. And I want to piggyback that with Josh's question, which is, do you have or have considered any training program, intern program, to pass on your knowledge to enthusiastic and committed others who want to continue this work and spread it within the Jewish community or beyond? Or short-term opportunities to be immersed in this work related? What about a program that integrates this hard work with serious Torah learning on these topics? So I think it's all connected. Definitely, I just want to say, I'm going to answer Josh's question, which is probably directed to you, is that we're definitely thinking about that. So that is, first of all, the group that comes out of this shavuot Sojourn, the email list and whatever of people that want to trade in grains, grow them, and actually make a commitment. Like Yosef said earlier, how like gardening is one thing and people are ready to start gardening a little, but to hit grains is just seems, despite it being ubiquitous to human survival, it just seems too hard for someone to try. So we definitely want to do that and mix this kind of work with serious Torah. So definitely keep in touch. And also, I just want to turn it to Ian. So if you could answer Josh's question directly, and then also in general, what are those resources that helped you along the way to move into a life that was both working and community building and educational, which I think is very unique.
From a human resources perspective, mentorship and learning opportunities have been hard to come by. There are not that many folks who are growing grains in a more sustainable and more intimate manner that are easily accessible. Grain growers also tend to be pretty obtuse people, and hard to nail down, and are very cliquey and suspicious of others. So it's sometimes I kind of think of grain growers as like little packs of raccoons defending their territory. There are a few very good written resources, textual resources. One of them is called The Organic Grain Grower by Jack Lazor, and I do have a copy not so far from here, but I will not run off from the screen. Again, The Organic Grain Grower by Jack Lazor. It's Chelsea Green Publishing. It's an amazing book. There's another book by an ag writer who was deceased a couple of years ago. His name is Gene Logsdon. And he's most famous for a book called The Contrary Farmer, which is sort of a good insight into old-timey grain-based agriculture. And then he has two follow-up books. One of them is just a small grains manual, where he talks about human-scale grain growing. And then another one is called Holy Shit, which is about manure in agriculture, and both animal-based manure and green manure, which is pretty awesome. In terms of the Jewish side of it, I have been very fortunate to develop a very strong relationship with Rabbi Moshe Heinemann, who is a leading posek or a halachic authority. He happens to be the Rav of Baltimore, of the Baltimore Orthodox community. He also happens to be a rabbi who is engaged head-on in technology and seeks to understand it. And he is kind of a tinkerer at heart. And I worked a lot with him in the meat industry, and we then forged a deeper bond over grains. And he has helped facilitate shmura wheat harvest for shmura matzah baking the past 2 seasons, or sorry, 3. We did it twice already with a gap of 1 year because of some long-term Lyme's disease debilitation that I suffer from. But he's been amazing, and he has, when other folks were kind of saying, why would you do that? Why would you do that? He said, that is the most amazing thing that I have encountered in a long time. How can I support you? And so from a Jewish perspective, he has been absolutely amazing. I also have a smaller, closer circle of folks that I learn Torah with, and I schmooze Torah and all of these topics with, and I think they have helped me a lot to formulate my relationship with it. And then more recently, I've found some old curmudgeons under rocks who have been willing to take me in. One of them in Southern Maryland and one of them in Pennsylvania. And so, yeah, that's sort of my resource base.
You're saying look under rocks and try to find curmudgeons. That's right. That's the advice?
Yes, that's my advice. That's my advice. And be persistent. So yeah. Those are the resources. I don't know. There was a follow-up second part of that question? No, that was it.
Well, one thing that from what you were talking about, I'm wondering, which is like when you started out, what was your biggest misunderstanding? What did you not understand that you wish you understood?
How do I phrase this in a way that sounds approachable? It takes significant resources to take a real stab in grains. You can grow a small patch of wheat for yourself and gain that satisfaction, but to take it to the next level, I think that I did not realize how expensive all of this equipment it was, and that that really, to do it right, you needed a lot of technologies coming together, and that you needed a working knowledge of physics and how all of these technologies come together to make it happen. And when the rock goes through the machine and it breaks, how do you fix it? And when you're really small like me and your scale is circa 1930s, not 2020s, like, how do you find that part you need for that piece of equipment that hasn't been made in 80 years? That's the kind of stuff that I was, when I was really starting out, I was more romantic, and I'm imagining myself scything in the field, and my wife has a babushka on her head and this big thing of straw on her back, and my kids are playing in the grain piles. No, it's not like that.
You ended up with a Japanese combine.
And then I ended up with a Japanese combine. There you go.
Well, the follow-up question to that is, what was the thing that you're right about, that you were right about and everyone said you were wrong?
The thing that I was right about was that there was real potential in it, and that potential is being realized right now, and that, we talked about it a little bit before, and I mentioned that I sort of fell into grains because it was less effort and less resources and less babysitting of the fields, given what I was doing in my life. But in that calculation as well, I was also thinking very much about durability under varying situations. And whereas fancy schmancy vegetables are great, when it really is getting down to it, do I want to be at the farmer's market competing with 50% of the other people at the market there for the same vegetables and not making a living? Or do I want to find a niche that nobody's doing and that is absolutely vital and necessary? And people still need to eat. So
that was born.
That was grains.
I mean, during the season and particularly during Omer, but definitely during this whole COVID, like, the importance of grain is borne out, right? It's just totally rises up there. Ian Yosef, it has been wonderful to talk to you, as always. And I know a couple of things came up just in this talk alone, especially like when it hit me, I was like, oh yeah, meat. First of all, with David's question about lechem. And I realized how special Ian Yosef Hertzmark is, that he literally is both definitions of lechem, either the Arabic or the grain. He has poured effort into both of them. So I think we will hopefully be able to have numerous follow-up talks with you. And it's been wonderful. The Torah and also the very particular tachlis aspect as well. Again, I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to give you an opportunity right before we go, because it will be at the hour-and-a-half mark, which is sort of the end of these sessions, is like, people want to, how do people get a hold of you? How do they reach you online? What's the best way to procure flour milled by Migrash Farms? Anything you'd like to talk about that? And then again, I'd like to just remind everyone that this is part of an ongoing series that's during this whole week. And you can go to shavuot, prosoncenter.org/shavuot 2020. You can sign up for any of these sessions. You can view Ian Yosef Hertzmark's wonderful moment, and you can support, give support to our work. But again, Ian, if you, how can people reach you online?
Well, I just shared my email address with folks. You're more than welcome. Anybody's more than welcome to shoot me a message. Right now, my volume of communication is ridiculous, and seeing as I'm also my own customer service rep, I've had to prioritize communications, but I'm doing a pretty good job of getting back to most people. And so if you have a question and you can be a little bit patient for a reply, definitely email me. In terms of the flowers and whatnot, migrashfarm.com is a place to pick it up. If you are in the Baltimore metro area, I have multiple delivery routes. If you're in the Baltimore Eruv, I've got delivery options. Yeah, one of the things that we're, please God, gonna start growing into a little bit more, which is not going to be so top secret as after I say it right now, but we're gonna.
All right, you've heard it here first, folks.
We're looking to get into seed production more seriously on the farm, and for those folks who are interested in growing seeds and all of this diversity, or growing wheat and all of the diversity of it, I hope to be a resource for that as well. So yeah. Be in touch.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
harvest is in about 6 weeks, give or take, is when it starts. And that's when all the grain starts coming back in, and we've more than doubled our acreage that we have working this year. So please God, we will be able to fill some amount of this this gap that we are currently feeling. Yeah.